So welcome, everybody. Let me begin with a question. How many of you saw the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980? Aha, quite a few. How many have been to the National Monument and seen it more recently? Most of you. Well, that's great. It's a wonderful place to go to, and there's a great deal we can learn from it, and we're going to go over some of that tonight. So our talk tonight is Learning from Catastrophe, Biological Recovery at Mount St. Helens. Not working. The flood in the days of Noah, which according to the Bible was global, catastrophic, and occurred only a few thousand years ago, disrupted all biological systems on the entire Earth to an incredible degree. The natural world, in essence, was put through a blender. Genesis chapter 7 describes the biological impact this way. It says, "Every living thing that moved on the earth perished, birds, livestock, wild animals, and the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died." Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Man and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds of the air were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark. Likewise, the Apostle Peter, referring to the flood, says, "Whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished." Yet amazingly, over the tens, hundreds, and thousands of years following the flood, plants, animals, and other organisms recovered, producing the ecosystems that we see on the modern Earth, like this magnificent old-growth redwood forest in Northern California. But you might ask, is such a belief reasonable? Is the biota really that resilient? Could biological recovery actually occur following a global cataclysm on the scale of Noah's flood, especially within the biblical time frame of only a few thousand years? And if recovery did occur, how did we get from there to here? That is, from barren flood and volcanic sediments worldwide to old-growth forest, tropical rainforest, savanna, desert, and Arctic tundra. By what ecological mechanisms or processes could such remarkable transformations take place? And to answer a question like that, we can begin by asking what possible sources of information we have available to us. And I've listed the 5 main ones here. We have the Bible. There could be ancient records other than the Bible, the geologic record, the discipline of biogeography, and the study of modern biological disturbances. Let me just mention each of these briefly. Here's where we begin our study with the Bible. Of course, the Bible doesn't tell us all we want to know about biological recovery. Just try and look up biological recovery in your concordance or Mount St. Helens. You don't get very far. So it doesn't tell us everything, but the Bible is our foundational source of information. It's where we start in attempting to understand biological recovery. It gives us the big picture, the proper worldview, the framework into which we fit our scientific observations. For example, the Bible, in no uncertain terms, teaches that the surface of the earth was once destroyed by a global flood event, and that afterwards life really did recover. Now, the left side of the slide shows what I learned about non-biblical ancient records that talk about what immediately happened after the flood. I really didn't find anything, but there could be something. I just don't know about it. The book on the right is interesting. It doesn't really talk about the flood, but it still is interesting and I think helpful. It's a book called A Forest Journey, The Role of Wood in the Development of Civilization by John Perlin. And this book, I believe, tells what the final product, at least in many areas on the earth, was, what the final product was. Because Mr. Perlin, he collected documents from places like Mesopotamia, Iraq, Greece, Cyprus, Crete, Spain, England, Italy, many other nations that today are not known for their forests, but were once densely forested. So again, I think this is indication that much of the flood recovery eventuated in some type of a forest. Here we see Grand Canyon, and you're probably familiar with Grand Canyon. You can see it is made of layer after layer after layer of sedimentary rock containing fossils. And all the layers have names, like at the top is the Kaibab limestone, and further down is the Coconino sandstone, and the Redwall limestone, and the Tepete sandstone, and so forth. Well, a geologist will read these layers, sort of like you and I read the pages of a book. And so knowledge of what the flood was like, the flood that produced these layers, in other words, greatly aids us in understanding things about the recovery from the flood. So this is another place to study. Again, another source is biogeography, and that's the study of the distribution of plants and animals on the modern Earth. From observations on what we see today, we can speculate how various organisms got to where they are today. You know, for example, why do giraffes reside in the African savanna, except for these two in the San Diego Zoo? You know, why don't giraffes live in Australia or South America? These are questions of biogeography. And lastly, the last source of information I mentioned was that we can study biological recovery following present-day disturbances. And by disturbances, I mean anything that disrupts an ecosystem. Things like wildfire, such as the huge burn in Yellowstone National Park in 1988, or local floods, or even tsunamis, or wind, like even hurricanes, and we certainly have seen those recently. Diseases, avalanches, glacial activity, and human-caused disturbance like clear-cut logging. Recovery occurs after that. But none of these produces nearly the intensity of the last one, which is volcanic eruption. And no eruption ever has been studied in as much detail as this one, the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. And that includes biological as well as geological study. This is a 1993 bibliography on biological research generated by the 1980 eruption. And it lists 637 article references and contains 70 abstracts of research in progress. And there's a lot more than that written today. So one would think that a careful review of the lessons learned at Mount St. Helens should greatly assist creationists in trying to construct some sort of a reasonable model of how biological recovery occurred. And this then is the topic that I want to explore further in the remainder of this program. So let's now look at what Mount St. Helens was like prior to the 1980 eruption, that is its pre-disturbance state. Probably many of you remember this mountain before the eruption. Mount St. Helens was once called the queen of the Cascade Range. It was youthful in appearance, snow-clad, frequently likened to an ice cream cone. One of the most beautiful mountains, I think, in the Pacific Northwest. And then extending from its flanks like a vast green blanket were thousands of acres of forests, both pristine forest and also plantation and clear-cut forest, but a lot of forest surrounded the mountain. And then you can see in this slide, peaceful Spirit Lake was nestled in the mountain's shadow to the north. Well, the tranquility of this setting was deceptive, however, and I think the indigenous peoples knew that. You can look at what the Native American names for the mountain are. One of them is Tawan Latla, which means Fire Mountain. Another, Lawilatla, one from whom smoke comes. And so it appears that the Klickitat, the Cowlitz, and the Chinook peoples understood Mount St. Helens' true nature. The landscape around Mount St. Helens before 1980 also showed evidence of past volcanic cataclysm. There were volcanic boulders that littered the forest floor in places. There were igneous flows, like lava flows, that determined the course of streams, as we see here in Lava Canyon. Even much of the soil was derived from the weathering of volcanic material. Mount St. Helens is one of those strange places where the soil actually falls out of the sky. In addition, we see here a timberline, where the trees end and the Rocky Mountain is more exposed above. And timberline elevation at Mount St. Helens was suppressed. It was lower than it should have been. For example, At Mount Rainier, the timberline elevation is 6,000 feet. But at Mount St. Helens, it was only 4,200 feet. And the reason was Mount St. Helens had erupted fairly recently, at least in the 1800s, and destroyed the vegetation. And so the vegetation was still slowly creeping up to its climatologic limit and hadn't had enough time to get there. So that low elevation speaks for relatively recent eruption. Well, besides volcanic eruption, the pre-disturbance landscape around Mount St. Helens was accustomed to lots of other disturbances, windstorms and so forth, and certainly fire, as we see evidence here. And one scientist in 1980, or following the eruption, he wrote this. He said, "The plant and animal species that are returning to the mountain slopes have seen it all before. For them as species, it was no unique event, and our studies of colonization must take this into account." I think that's an important statement because, in other words, before the eruption, the flora and fauna of Mount St. Helens was already adapted to recover from major disturbance. It had been there and done that, as the expression goes. Well, we could go on for some time and describe more about the geology and biology of the pre-1980 Mount St. Helens, but of course we don't have time to do that. But let's move now to the disturbance itself. And so it was on a beautiful Sunday morning, May 18th, 1980, that cataclysm fell on the Mount St. Helens landscape, and the toll on biological systems was quite staggering. Act 1 of the volcano's performance that morning was something that had never been seen before. The mountain did not erupt vertically, as you would expect, not initially. It erupted sideways. There was a sideways blast to the north that simply went directly over the landscape. And in the space of between 3 and 6 minutes, 230 square miles of that forest that we had at Mount St. Helens, 230 square miles was destroyed in several minutes and turned into a gray, lifeless appearing moonscape. So let's look at this slide here. This is a pre-eruption photograph taken from Mount St. Helens looking to the north, and you can see Mount Rainier in the distance, and you can see the part of the forest, and this is mostly old-growth forest that you're seeing here. And then you can also picture or see Spirit Lake. It looks like 2 lakes here, but it's actually all Spirit Lake, 1 lake. Now what I want to do is in the next slide show you a photograph taken in the summer of 1980 after the eruption at approximately the same spot. I say approximately because this spot was gone by then and they simulated it in a helicopter. So see if you can see any difference between this and this. Notice anything there? Let me try that again. Before the eruption, after the eruption. Pretty striking. And so here again, we see Mount Rainier pretty much unaffected, but now the forest is gone. And in place of it is this gray volcanic landscape. And there's a name for this, it's called the blast zone, and we're only seeing a small portion of it, of course. You can see Spirit Lake, which is actually a lot bigger than it used to be. And actually, you do see part of the forest here because it is floating in Spirit Lake. You can notice there that about half of the lake surface is covered by a floating log or vegetation mat. I'll point out also that in the front or towards us from Spirit Lake, the lower left side of the photograph, is a fairly flat plain just covered with volcanic material. And that's called the Pumice Plane. We'll refer to that in a bit. But going back, you can see what the Pumice Plane was like before the eruption. It was old-growth forest, and afterwards, it looked like that. Over 4 billion board feet of timber was felled, enough to build 400,000 three-bedroom houses. Most animals residing above ground died. There simply was no place for them to hide. Here's a death toll that's estimated by the Washington Department of Game. They estimated that 11 million salmon and trout were killed. All the birds in the blast zone died. They had no hiding place. Snowshoe hares, about 11,000. Black-tailed deer, 5,000. Roosevelt elk, 1,500. Coyote, 1,400. Bobcat, 300. Black bear, 200. Mountain goats, 15. Cougar, 15. Those are the estimates. And then 57 people were eventually determined to be dead or missing, including 1 or 2 in this vehicle. This is an important map. This is a map of the blast zone, and I want you to pay close attention to this. It helps you understanding what we're talking about hereafter. And so the base of that arrow is at the mountain. And in front of the mountain to the north is a red area, which is the Pumice Plane that I've mentioned. And then extending to the left from that is a lighter tan area, which extends down where the Toutle River runs. And that's the debris avalanche, as it's called. In other words, it's the landslide that once was the top 1,300 feet of Mount St. Helens. That part of Mount St. Helens simply fell from the mountain, and in this location slid about 14 miles down the Toutle River and buried it. Also, most of this area is simply a tan color, and that is the Blowdown Forest. And the Blowdown Forest is where the blast destroyed the forest. Really close to the mountain, the blast took the trees and the soil, and they simply flew with that sideways blast. But further out, the trees fell, and they lay where they were fallen. You also have down the streams, like the Toutle River and the Pine Creek and so forth, mud flows that went out from the mountain and traveled some distance, including blocking the shipping channels of the Columbia River. Around the whole edge of this blast zone, you notice it's hatch marked. And that's called the Scorch Zone, or some people call it the zone of the standing dead, because the blast, as it went outward and reached that perimeter, was still hot enough to kill trees, but it had lost its power to knock them down, so it left a zone of standing dead. So this arrow now is called a gradient of disturbance. At the base of the arrow, by the mountain, everything was destroyed. No life persisted. And so maybe you'd expect recovery to be slower there. And then as you work your way out along this disturbance gradient, you get to areas that are less and less disturbed until finally, if you went far enough beyond this image, you'd reach the unaffected forest. Any scientist who's going to work in this blast zone has to ask 2 important questions. And the first question would be, what was my study site where I'm going to do my research? What was it like before the eruption? Am I working in an old clear cut? Am I working in what was old growth forest or a mountain meadow or what? And the second thing that's important for the researcher to ask is, what happened geologically in my study site? Am I working in the Blowdown Forest, or am I on the debris avalanche, or am I on the Pumice Plane, or where am I? Those are very important issues that the researcher must decide or must answer. Well, several years ago, I reviewed the literature on biological recovery at Mount St. Helens and attempted to relate it to recovery following Noah's flood. And this was the article that resulted, and it was used for several years by the Institute for Creation Research in their field studies, which they had on most summers for a while. And as I read through this voluminous literature, it became increasingly apparent that there were several principles or themes which surfaced over and over again. And I listed some of them here, and there are many more. For example, one theme throughout this recovery story is that of resilience. Resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to recover from disturbance. And Mount St. Helens has done really well at that. It's been very resilient. Also, it's important to realize that the geologic stuff, the geologic context, has a lot to do with how organisms recover. And of course, so does weather and climate. Water, of course, is important, as all organisms need water. Biological legacies, that's a term you may not have heard, because it's a new term that was coined at Mount St. Helens, and we'll refer to it several times coming up, but it simply means, biological legacies are simply the biological materials, both living and dead, that went through the eruption. In other words, a pocket gopher underground that survived is a biological legacy, a living legacy. A tree trunk that was broken and died and lays there is a biological legacy, even though it's not a living tree anymore. Immigration is important, and so are the others, and I'm not going to go further right now, but we'll illustrate some of these coming up. Also now, concerning these themes, a big question to ask is this: do the recovery themes illustrated at Mount St. Helens provide any insight into how the Earth might have recovered biologically following Noah's flood? In other words, are there sort of general principles or universal principles demonstrated at Mount St. Helens that apply to many or even most or all disturbances? That certainly is possible. What I'd like to do now then is to take you on a tour through the blast zone. And as we do this, we'll just look at what's out there, but also illustrate a few of these ideas, of these themes or principles. And our excursion is going to begin in the crater. So here's a telephoto picture I took of the crater from Harry's Ridge a few years back. And you can see that the crater has a horseshoe-shaped rim. It is intact to the east, to the south, and the west, but to the north, it doesn't exist. That's called the breach, and that's where that sideways blast blew out that part of the crater rim. Within the crater, there's a small mountain. Actually, it's not all that small, and it's called a lava dome. After the big eruption over several years, some thick, pasty lava oozed out and didn't go anywhere. It just piled up and made this lava dome. And there's a second one there if you took the photo now, because between 2004 and 2008, I believe it was, a second lava dome has appeared in the crater. You can see also there's a big canyon right in the middle foreground there, and that's called Step Canyon. We'll take a closer look at that in just a minute. There also, I should add, is a glacier that has formed, a new glacier that wasn't there. Mount St. Helens had about a dozen glaciers, but many of them were destroyed. But a new glacier developed in the crater, and it's simply called Crater Glacier. I don't think you can really see it here, but it is there today. So if you wanted to explore this crater a little more closely, and you don't have a helicopter at your disposal, there's two ways to do it. One is to climb the south side of the mountain. You simply need a climbing permit, and you end up in the middle of the photograph on the rim. Or, if you have a research permit, you can climb up beside that step canyon directly into the crater and walk into it. So let me take you on both those trips quickly here. Here's our daughter, Stacy, climbing the south face of Mount St. Helens in the summer of 1998. It's not a technical climb, but it's quite a strenuous scramble. And Stacy told me this was the hardest thing she'd ever done after we completed it, but she did fine. Got up there. You reach the rim, and we're looking towards the east, and that's Mount Adams in the distance, and you can see there's a small, narrow pathway that you can safely walk on that rim, but you don't want to step on that snow cornice because it overhangs the crater and could easily give way, and you'd have a fast trip down into the crater. Here's Stacy again. The crater is behind her. And if Stacy would now turn directly around and look to the north, here's what she'd see. This is sort of the opposite of the first view of the crater I gave you. That was from looking the other direction. So here we're at the summit, looking north. You can see Mount Rainier to the distance. You can see part of the blast zone out there, and Spirit Lake is visible. You can also see that you're looking through that breach that was where the crater rim was blown away. The lava dome's apparent, and I don't think you can appreciate the glacier in this one particularly either. Well, one of my first recollections on reaching the summit was that of birds. I got up on just on the summit rim, and all of a sudden 2 ravens came from behind me, and they just swooped right down into the crater. Somehow I thought that was very dramatic, and it was, and I still remember it. The other thing I remember about birds is as we climbed Mount St. Helens, all along the way there were alpine wildflowers, and there were hummingbirds feeding on the nectar from those wildflowers. Going back to 1980, just days after the eruption, geologists in orange flight suits were working in the crater, and they heard these strange buzzy noises about them, and they didn't at first know what they were. But it turned out they were being dive-bombed by hummingbirds, who probably thought the geologists were the biggest orange flowers they had ever seen. Remember now that I said that all birds in the blast zone were killed in the eruption. There was no hiding place for them. In other words, concerning birds, there were no living biological legacies. Therefore, all bird recovery had to come by immigration. That is, the movement of birds from the surrounding forest or from more distant sites, like the migrant birds. They had to move from outside and come into the devastated zone. And of course, birds are very adept at that. They fly, they are able to move quickly, they are said to be very agile. You can contrast, in the idea of immigration, birds with something like a woodland salamander, which are said to be sedentary. They just don't move around much at all, they stay put. And so the birds come in rapidly, but certain other species, like those salamanders, would take eons of time, probably, to actually get into parts of the blast zone. Immigration is an important theme to consider as we start to unravel what has happened at Mount St. Helens. Here's another route now into the crater. We'll climb in an erosion gully up the north side of the mountain, directly into the crater. That's Dr. Steve Austin there. We go by this step canyon you saw from a distance. That's about 700 feet deep, and was not there immediately after the eruption. It was formed after the eruption by mud flows, a very rapidly carved canyon. And here we've entered the canyon, or entered the crater, and look at all the life. Well, I looked with a magnifying glass and I found one plant, and I put an arrow by it so you can see there's a plant growing there. Not much more, a little bit more, but not much. But the thing that struck me as where the life really was, that I could see, was in Step Creek, which you can see flowing there. It was green. So it was full of photosynthetic organisms. And this, again, is a basic principle of recovery at St. Helens, is that where there's water, life recovers much more quickly than where the areas are dry. That's pretty simple. That should be intuitive. We should know that, and I guess we do. But certainly it does explain a lot of why certain organisms are where they are and such. Another view of the crater, when you hike in there, you've got to walk all over that pumice material. By 1993, which is when we went in there, they had found several species of insects, mice had gotten in there, Pacific tree frogs of all things, a few bird species, and a variety of plants, but relatively few, but several species. But by and large, this was a very difficult place for recovery to occur. In fact, I don't think you should even call it recovery, because prior to the eruption, what was this? This was the inside of the mountain. No life existed there. So we're starting from absolute zero as far as recovery goes. There's no biological legacies. And if you're familiar with the terminology of ecologists, this would be called primary succession, recovery on a surface that was never previously populated by organisms. Crater is also just plain inhospitable, cold as deep snowpack in the winter, hot and dry like a desert in the summer. And also it is geologically unstable. You can see a rock fall coming down by the arrow. When you walk in there, you want to stay towards the center, not go underneath the cliffs. Again, another principle that plays out throughout the blast zone is that it require that for plant life in particular to recover, you have to have geological stability. Plants do not do well on collapsing crater walls or on stream beds that are repeatedly scoured by floods during the winter and so forth. You need a stable environment. Again, most of these things are pretty common sense, but they do explain what you see. We leave the crater now, go down past Step Canyon onto the Pumice Plane, which I showed you on the previous photographs. And the Pumice Plane we see here was once much flatter than this. This is a few years after the eruption, so it's a little more eroded, but it gives you an idea. And remember, this part of this flat area in the center of the photograph, that whole area was old-growth forest. It was just a haven of life. But that life was blasted, incinerated, and deeply buried up to 600 feet of deposits in some places. And so the life that was there was totally obliterated. Nothing survived. Again, this is primary succession also. There was no life on this new surface ever. There had not been any. And so on this barren surface, and this is what it looks like, this is where things have been recovering, not too inviting perhaps. The surface is called desert pavement. It's all particles of pumice, and the really fine stuff, like the ash, gets blown away by the wind, and the coarser stuff remains as a fairly stable surface. But there's a big problem here. This type of volcanic material, which is called dacite at the mountain, does not have a lot of nutrients in it for plants. It doesn't have nitrogen, for example, and plants have to have nitrogen. But despite that, we found that there are plants that do colonize those pumice surfaces. And here's a prairie lupin in the foreground of this photograph. And so life is returning there. And of course, what returns has to be an immigrant. That is, the seeds have to be blown in by the wind because nothing survived. And what you see there now are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. The first plant was found in 1982 by two researchers named Charlie Crisafulli and James McMahon. And here's Charlie Crisafulli. I went out with him one day and spent a day in the field with him. He's probably the most knowledgeable person on everything up there. He's an amazing guy. And Charlie and another researcher discovered that first plant, and so as researchers, they tracked it. They followed it to see what it was going to do. And by 1989, there were over 169,000 progeny from that founder plant. And they kept track of all that. What you see here is the similar idea, but this is on the plains of Abraham, and it's a slightly different species of plant, but gives you the idea. Going back to lupin, is a really important plant in that it does something that's terribly important. It fixes nitrogen. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, know the nitrogen isn't broken. But there's nitrogen in the air, and plants have to have nitrogen, but they're unable to take nitrogen out of the air. They have to have it in the soil in a fertilizer form. And so lupin and some other plants are able to, or they have little nodules on their roots, which are little houses for certain species of bacteria to live in. And those bacteria are able to fix nitrogen. They take the atmospheric nitrogen and they convert it into nitrogen compounds like ammonia and so forth. In other words, the lupin and the bacteria that live with it make fertilizer. That helps the lupin, but it also prepares the soil. It prepares the way for other plants that are coming. Here we see another plant. This is Sitka alder, and alder also fixes nitrogen. So this slide shows the development of soil. The rock itself is weathering and decomposing and forms the mineral component of the soil. And the alder leaves fall down, and they contain carbon, and they contain phosphorus and so forth, and certainly they contain nitrogen. So this is the way soil develops at Mount St. Helens. And there are places now where you have entire mountainsides that are just packed with alder. This is red alder, and it just covers mountainsides, and it's just pumping the nitrogen into the soil, and then in a decade or two or three, the conifer trees will be taking over probably from this alder, and will benefit from the nitrogen that is already there. The system works, it recovers. Somebody thought this through, I think, when they designed it. So, many other plants are reclaiming the Pumice Plane. This is a struggling fir tree of some species. This is the beginning of an old-growth forest. You're right here, it just has a ways to go. Here's a lonely-looking lodgepole pine. This plant is called partridge foot. And here's one of my favorites called pussy paws. The floral structures simply lie flat on the pumice surfaces, which is good because it's so windy up there. They get blown around and broken. So that one is well adapted. By far the fastest recovery, however, is where the streams flow across the Pumice Plane. As we've said, the presence of water forms the best place for life to recover. This is along the water. It's a Lewis's monkey flower. Well, let me go from that idea of water aiding recovery to the best example I know up there of an aquatic system that recovered, and that is Spirit Lake. On May 18th, 1980, Spirit Lake died. The lake is located just north of Mount St. Helens, and the Pumice Plane forms the lake's south shore. On the morning of May 18th, about a third of the debris avalanche, in other words, the top of the mountain as it collapsed and slid, about a third of that plowed directly into Spirit Lake. And it caused the water of the lake to slosh up on the mountains to the north, over 800 feet on those mountains. And that giant wave, or probably waves, picked up that entire old-growth forest that was growing there. 1 million trees, logs, the soil, other plants, animals, everything that was there. And they carried it back into Spirit Lake. But when the water was actually out as a wave, a new bottom formed in Spirit Lake because the debris avalanche raised the bottom of Spirit Lake 200 feet. So the wave comes in with its logs and materials to a new basin 200 feet higher than it was a few moments ago. Later in the day, oven-hot pyroclastic flows, really hot material, boiled into the lake's south shore as well. And so the first helicopter crews that came over Spirit Lake after the eruption reported they didn't see it. They didn't see it, and they said it looks like it's gone. In fact, the headline on the Oregonian on Monday, May 19th, included the statement that Spirit Lake was gone. Why didn't they see it? Well, because it was covered over by 1 million floating logs and other material, and the rest of it was covered by floating rock. Because at Mount St. Helens, not only does the soil fall out of the sky, the rock also floats. It's pumice, it's full of air bubbles, and it floats. So, of course, they found out that the lake actually was still there. And when scientists returned to Spirit Lake, they reported that it had been, quotes, transformed into a roiling, steaming body of degraded water choked with logs and mud. It was a lot worse than what we see in my photograph, because this was taken a little bit afterwards. They predicted that it would take 10, 20 more years even for the water quality to recover. And it actually took less than 5 years. So how was Spirit Lake reborn? And it's kind of a complicated story, and I'm not going to go into all that. It involves microbiology and a certain amount of chemistry, but just a brief version is something like this. Following the eruption, the waters of Spirit Lake were warm. And they were saturated with all this organic debris and material and mineral nutrients and toxic chemicals and so forth. It was a mess. And in this brew, bacteria were really happy. They proliferated like crazy at an astounding rate, so much that the bacteria used up all the oxygen in the waters of Spirit Lake. And so with the oxygen gone, nothing could live in the lake except for certain bacteria that are anaerobic or don't require oxygen. And that's all there was for a while. At that time, they said the lake boiled like a cauldron from escaping carbon dioxide, methane, and hydrogen sulfide generated by these bacteria. And the odor was overwhelming. Some researchers who went in there developed what became known as the red zone fever, which was possibly a type of Legionnaire's disease. But then, due to a succession of different bacterial types over a little bit of time, plus a lot of physical processes like just the wind and the waves and the winter rains and the sunshine, Spirit Lake started to heal. And within 5 years, the waters returned to a pristine pre-eruption quality. That was quite amazing and unexpected. The first rainbow trout was found in 1992. Somebody promptly named it Harry, after probably you know who. Of course, no fish could have survived in the lake, so the question is where Harry came from, and now there's lots of rainbow trout in the lake. And the consensus at this point is that somebody illegally stocked Spirit Lake, and the trout are continuing to do well in it. Here we now see we leave Spirit Lake. This is a debris avalanche. Now, we said part of it went into Spirit Lake and part down the Toutle River. Well, here's another part of that debris avalanche. In other words, this is the top of Mount St. Helens that fell away. And this debris avalanche has hummocks. It has mounds. And these mounds, each one is called a hummock, and they're sort of semi-intact portions of Mount St. Helens. And in this location, that avalanche went up and over about a 1,200-foot ridge and down the other side. You can see it's ascending the ridge here in this photograph. Now, as you look at this slide, you can see a couple of things that we've already talked about. You can see that there's alder that's recovering in the foreground. Well, that's because there's a stream there, the water. And of course, it's pumping nitrogen into the soil. You also can see that there's no plants on the front part of that hummock because it's very geologically unstable. One more thing about this area, this debris avalanche deposit, just I think an interesting story. Just a few days, I think it was May 28th, after the eruption, a geologist named Fred Swenson was working on this debris avalanche down in front of Mount St. Helens. And like geologists do, he was digging holes to look at the deposits. And as he dug holes and looked really close, he found that woven throughout all these particles of pumice were little filaments, almost like little cobweb filaments. And at first he didn't know what he was looking at. He thought it was very puzzling. He later learned that these were all filaments of fungi, because there are such a thing as fire fungi. When we have our forest fires, there are spores of certain fungi that have been in the ground for a long time, and they only germinate with heat. So after a forest fire, you'll find certain fungi in the forest that aren't normally there. Same thing happened here. The heat from this ash that fell on these deposits heated it up so that the spores germinated. And so Dr. Swenson believes that the first biological responders to this eruption were these fire fungi, these little filaments. Is that important? Well, yeah, because the fungi formed mats of material on the surface eventually, and then mosses grew on these mats, and then other plants grew there, so they really were the start of plant recovery in some areas. Again, it looks like these ecosystems are designed to recover. Here we have an erosion gully on the debris avalanche deposit. You can see hummocks there too. As you'd expect, the plants don't grow so well where it's been eroded away. That makes sense. But here is early in recovery, and it's the opposite. Early in recovery, you had these pumice deposits over everything, and they buried the soil where the plants had been and where the plants' roots and seeds were, or still are. And so where the erosion occurred, it washed away the deposits, the overlying deposits, and plants recovered in the erosion gullies, the exact opposite of what you would normally anticipate. On the debris avalanche, there's ponds and a lot of wetlands that have formed. So the eruption destroyed certain habitats, but it created a lot of new habitats as well. And in these wetlands, of course, you'd expect a lot of life. Where there's water, there's a lot of life. And you can see that here we have cattails, and there are willows and duckweed floating on the water, and there's horsetail, and there's an invasive plant called Eurasian milfoil, kind of a nuisance up there because it clogs things up. It's a non-native invasive. How did it get in there? It rode in on duck feet. The ducks have it on their feet when they fly in, and they leave it behind. As you continue to look around, you find insects. Here's a caterpillar for a moth species. It's on a willow leaf, and here's a dragonfly. Here's a red-legged frog looking at you out of a pond. And this little green fellow in the middle of that volcanic rock is a Pacific tree frog. Kind of a cute little guy, I think. And this is the one that actually made it into the crater. Amazing that it could do that. Now, sometimes the shores of these wetland areas in the debris avalanche are just black with tadpoles. And in this case, this is the western toad tadpoles. And here we see they've metamorphosed, and now they're little toadlets hopping around. Early in the recovery, there was a hiker was out, and he saw a hillside ahead of him. It looked like the whole thing was moving. And as he got closer, he found the whole hillside was nothing but toads hopping toe to toe. So we had these booms and populations. There was nothing to control the toads, so they just took over. And then, of course, they didn't have food, so then they all died. And it was these ups and downs, these population swings were a common thing early in the following the eruption. The main reptile you'll see is the common garter snake, or the northwestern garter snake here, and another view of him. Early in recovery, there was no standing trees, so the birds that did best were those that nest on the ground, like the juncos. The dark-eyed junco, here's its nest, and there's the young. In the wetlands, birds came in that inhabit wetlands, like a red-winged blackbird. On the debris avalanche, you also find a lot of these kind of strange-looking trees. You know, what is that? Well, that tree is sort of a bonsai that was not made by people, but by an animal. And that same animal made these markings on the alder sapling, and there's another sure sign of the animal. Nice composition, I think. And then there's its track, and by now you probably know, it leaves its bones behind sometimes in the spring from the winter kill. And there's the Roosevelt elk. And the elk all died. You can't hide if you're a big animal like that, so they all died, but they have recovered well and come in from the surrounding forest. And they have a lot to do with plant recovery because, first of all, the elk set back plant recovery because they trample on plants and they browse on plants. But they also help it. And for one thing they do is they eat outside the blast zone or in the forest, and then they come into the blast zone, and in their droppings are seeds from various plants that they bring in, and those plants establish. That was studied by that Charlie Crisafulli I showed you, because he would, for a period of time, collected elk droppings, and he would take them home and put them in his refrigerator, and then later plant them in his greenhouse to see what grew. And he identified lots of species of plants. Why did he put them in the refrigerator? Well, you see, a lot of our plants around here, if they go to seed in the fall, and if the seeds fall down and germinate, the plant starts to come up, and then winter comes, they die. So plants, many of them have to go through a cold period before they're able to germinate. That is, they have to go through winter, and then they're able to germinate. So in his refrigerator, he simulated winter. Elk also made flower pots, sort of. The elk tracks, depressions in the deposits would catch debris blowing across the Pumice Plane, like organic material of any sort. Also seeds, and water would accumulate. So the elk tracks became like little flower pots in which many plants recovered. And so they were helpful in that way. Now, here is the Blowdown Forest zone, which actually composes the largest part of the blast zone. You can look at that forest, it's incredible. The trees are all laying where they were felled. Huge amount of biological legacies here, of course. We're going out our disturbance gradient now. And again, an important principle is the more biological legacies that you have, the more rapid recovery will be at any given site in the blast zone. Snow also played a role because snow insulates, it protects. And so many things survived if they were covered by snowpack, which still persisted in May. And here's the Meta Lake Basin. If you've visited Mount St. Helens, you may well have gone to Meta Lake. And this was an old-growth forest in 1980, but it had a lot of young Pacific silver fir in the understory that weren't very big. They were just kind of slowly growing there. The blast comes along and takes out the old-growth forest, and so the young trees, which were actually covered by the snowpack, they lived, and now they're taking over, and there they are. They're growing like ever, the new forest that's replacing the old one that was destroyed. Trout, like cutthroat trout, persisted in Spirit Lake, and because of the brook trout actually, it persisted in Spirit Lake because it was ice covered and they were protected. Also certain salamanders, these are called Northwestern Salamanders, they survived in the bottom of the lake, which was snow covered as well, or ice covered. It's remarkable that amphibians like this salamander, this type of salamander, not those woodland ones I mentioned before, but this one likes to move around. And so do those toads, and so do those little Pacific tree frogs I showed you. And some of these amphibians have been able, they're delicate creatures that need water, but they've been able to traverse kilometers to very dry sites on the Pumice Plain. How do they do that? How do they travel those distances? And it's been found that they do that in part by traveling when the landscape is, quotes, permeable, in other words, wet. In the spring, with the spring rains and the fall rains, the landscape is very wet, allowing these animals to travel great distances and live. The other thing they do is they take the subway. The subway up there was made by pocket gophers. Their burrows just interlace all over the place. And so these creatures travel through pocket gopher holes, burrows, and I certainly have looked into those burrows and seen toads looking back at me. And so those are a couple of methods how these creatures dispersed. Here's evidence of the pocket gopher. There's the critter himself. These gophers also brought up lots of mounds, as they usually do, and in those mounds were seeds, and those seeds started growing on top of the pumice deposits, and they were a big help too. Gophers and erosion, actually, both of them were very helpful. We usually think the opposite. Numerous plants survived and emerged in the Blowdown Forest and forest plants. That's called fireweed. It was especially common. And blueberries have recovered, and they're really good, or huckleberries, I should say. Insects have recovered as well. Here's a strange statement. A.B. Adams, a researcher, said this: there seemed to be justification to believe that it would be impossible for insects to recover at all. Why would anybody say that? Well, there actually is a reason. And the reason is that Mount St. Helens ash acts as an insecticide. When it's dry and fresh, it lands on insects, and it degrades the exoskeleton, their outer covering. It gets rid of the waxes that they have so that they basically dry up and die. And it also clogs up their breathing pores, and it clogs up their intestinal tracts. So the ash was a good insecticide. There was worry about bark beetles taking over the place, but that never really happened, probably because of the insecticide effect of volcanic ash. Well, we have grasshoppers. They control the plant populations. There's a tiger beetle. Oh, and spiders. Spiders are numerous. And you might say, how did spiders get in there? How did they immigrate in? Did they just hike in on all eights or what? And the answer is they flew. But spiders don't fly. Well, they sort of do. Juvenile spiders of many species, when they're ready to disperse, they climb up on a bush, they let out a long filament of their spider silk, and with the breezes blowing, they just let go and they sail like on a parachute. And it's called ballooning. And so huge numbers of spiders came in that way, and that's the primary way in which spiders got to where they are today. Of course, there's been numerous birds up there. I don't think we'll say too much about them. There's a grouse, 27,000 grouse were killed, it's estimated, and there's what's now called a sooty grouse, doing well. Mammals have recovered pretty well in this Blowdown Forest zone. There's a golden-mantled ground squirrel, no stripe on the face, not a chipmunk, it's a golden-mantled ground squirrel. There's evidence of the beaver, of course. They simply, didn't survive in the blast zone, but they ate their way up the streams as the vegetation recovered, and they are doing well. There's a beaver dam, and the deer are back, of course. And that brings us now to the edge, that scorch zone. So we have, surrounding this blast zone, an area of standing dead, where the blast was hot and killed the trees, but didn't have the power to knock them down. And so much of the edge looked like this. These trees are progressively falling down each winter now, but there was this rim of standing dead trees. And then if you go beyond the scorch zone, you start to get into the intact forest, where it actually, the trees are alive. They were coated by this ash that fell for 9 hours out of the sky, so they suffered some difficulties here, but they survived, and here's an ash-covered forest. And then if you go beyond that, you come to the intact forest that really wasn't affected by the eruption. So, in other words, we've gone out our entire distance through this disturbance gradient from the most intense disturbance out to where there was minimal or no disturbance. And so, with that sort of panorama look at the eruption and the results of the eruption, and particularly what happened with some plants and animals, and also mentioning a few of the themes as far as the processes that are occurring, I'd like to just conclude with a look back at Noah's flood. And we weren't there after Noah's flood. We can't know everything, can't know a lot of things for sure, but we can speculate in a reasonable manner, I think. So, do the recovery themes illustrated at Mount St. Helens provide insight into how the Earth recovered biologically in the post-Noahic flood period? An interesting quote here is from the publication of the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service, and it says this: the in-depth ecological research on Mount St. Helens and at other volcanoes is enabling researchers to identify universal themes in ecosystem response to disturbance. In other words, the secular scientific community believes that recovery themes observed at Mount St. Helens have general, even universal, applicability to various other disturbances. And certainly, that should, you would think, include a global cataclysmic event like Noah's flood. It's also important to realize there are some similarities between Noah's flood and Mount St. Helens. They were both catastrophic geologic events involving volcanism. The flood had a lot of volcanic activity, certainly a lot of flooding, massive erosion, deposition, some of the same processes in both. In each, there was destruction of a pre-disturbance ecosystem. In both, there were biological legacies, and in both, processes were initiated which eventually caused recovery or resulted in recovery. Of course, we have to realize also there were many differences between Noah's flood and Mount St. Helens, so our speculations need to be tempered by that as well. They were not identical events at all. Here are 8 of the themes I had listed before, and I'll just like to comment on those briefly as examples of what we can speculate about concerning Noah's flood and its relationship to Mount St. Helens. The first is resilience. Severely disturbed ecosystems at Mount St. Helens are recovering well, beyond expectation. In other words, they are very, very resilient. And so this is kind of the overarching observation at the mountain. And I think it lends credibility to the idea that the entire Earth actually could recover from a global catastrophe like Noah's flood. Now, this concept of biological legacies, that term that was coined at Mount St. Helens, and we've talked a little bit about it. Again, it's just the living and once living materials that came through the flood or the eruption or whatever. What were the legacies of Noah's flood? What would we expect? Well, we would expect in the ark there would be man, land animals, and what I call hitchhikers, just microbes, insects, seeds, spores, the incidental things that would be in the feed and in the, just simply in the environment there. Also, in the floodwaters, we would have fishes, amphibians, aquatic invertebrates, aquatic plants. On floating vegetation mats, we had a big floating log mat at Mount St. Helens. Well, when you rip up the whole Earth's forests, and I'm sure there was huge forests before the flood, must have been huge floating vegetation mats in the flood. And in those, there would be plant material, fungi, seeds, spores, insects, various things would survive in those mats, which would serve as sort of a refuge for them. Also, there are Pumice Rafts, and these occur today. That an undersea eruption occurs in the Pacific Ocean of a volcano, and all this pumice surfaces from that undersea eruption and floats as a huge mat. There are photos of this that you can see, and people have documented this in recent times. And these actually harbor organisms and transport them, particularly marine creatures, but certainly they could also transport and harbor insects, for example, that would be in that would also be present. So that's another possible place for biological legacies. In the atmosphere, tiny spores, seeds, insects could persist. Even buried in the more surface sediments, there could be plant materials, invertebrates, things that could survive a little bit of burial. So following the flood then, picture all these big mats of vegetation and such floating, and as the floodwaters recede, these mats would ground. They would end up on the ground, and they would become a let's call it a hot spot for biological recovery. All these biological legacies get plopped onto the ground, and at that site, huge amount of recovery occurs, and then of course can spread out from there. Immigration must have involved short distance and long distance immigration in the flood. For example, organisms in these hot spots where log mats deposited, they could simply expand outward slowly into their immediate surroundings. That's immigration. But man and land animals would spread out only from one site, the ark. And so for them, they would travel throughout the entire Earth. So that's long distance immigration as well. And notice that the long distance immigration would take some time for man and vertebrates to cover various parts of the Earth. And during that time, all these plant materials and insects and other things that are already spread all over the Earth, they weren't on the ark, they survived in the floodwaters, they have had time to recover and would produce plant material and insects and various things that could be food sources for many of the dispersing vertebrate creatures from the ark. Geological stability is necessary. I think we can envision, as we think of the post-flood world, envision it as a very geologically active place, with the breaching of natural dams, with local flooding, with landslides, with dust storms, with rivers changing course, with active volcanoes. There had to be many volcanoes active at that time. And would say plants simply wouldn't establish in areas that were highly active geologically until things stabilized. On the other hand, erosion now, which is always, we think destroying plant life, well, after the flood, as the waters rushed off, would not erosion cut through these sediments, and if there were materials buried in them, expose them so that they could readily recover plant life, for example. Aquatic systems. I think I would have to think that at the end of the flood, essentially all biological or all aquatic systems like lakes and streams and even the oceans would be highly degraded and would have to go through some sort of process in which the water would become more pristine and capable of better supporting life. So what happened at Spirit Lake, I would think, is an example of what must have happened in many, many places following the flood. Maybe a little different in different places, but the same ideas, perhaps. Insects, immediately after the flood, would have had a lot of carcasses and dead plant material to eat, and they would probably proliferate and be very numerous. They didn't have so many predators probably right away. All the vertebrate predators were just leaving the ark. And one control over insects could very well have been volcanic ash. That would, if there were eruptions after the flood, the volcanic ash could have functioned to control insect populations. And lastly, we must remember that humans also play a part in biological recovery. At Mount St. Helens, humans salvaged log, planted conifer seedlings, built roads, sowed grass seed to control erosion, stabilized Spirit Lake with a drainage tunnel, and established a national monument. All of these activities have affected recovery. So in a similar fashion, post-flood man would have hunted, developed agriculture, built roads and houses, and probably intentionally transported plants and animals even to distant sites. So humans have to be left in the equation as far as understanding what happened biologically. Well, I think that gives you an idea. I think all of this could be developed more, explored more, and should be. But I think disturbances provide a way of looking at post-flood recovery that should give us some insights and some help in trying to develop some sort of a model on what likely happened following Noah's flood. And with that, I think I said enough. So, Chris?
We need to take a quick offering. Please help us as much as you can. We're responsible for paying our speaker honorariums each month. Dr. Swenson drove down from Portland today. He's staying with Bruce Barton, who also has spoken for us here a couple times. Bruce, I really appreciate you hosting him. And let me just offer up the offering and word of prayer. Father, we thank you for Dr. Swenson, and we ask again for your blessings upon him and his ministry. And Father, we ask for your blessings upon the offering that's taken up this evening, that the monies will be used to expand the knowledge of the gospel, of the saving grace that came through the sacrifice of your Son, Jesus. And Father, we just lift up Cedar Park to you and ask for your blessings upon it and the many facets of ministries that they're involved in, and Cedar Park Christian Schools, that many people will come to learn about this church and about the opportunities to go to school here. We ask all things in Jesus' name. Amen. So while the plates are going around, we got a time for a couple of questions, and maybe it'd be okay if we kind of started passing the attendance sheet around. I think we're okay in that, disturbing you, but try to sign that because they really want to know our numbers, and that's all great. So yeah, I see a couple of hands in the back, so we do have time for, well, we need to limit it though. They'd like for me to close on time, which it would help if I started on time and then we could close on time, so throw me under the bus if you need to. But I do want to give a couple opportunities for questions. So I think there was one right here.
Hello, thank you. I'm Patricia, and my question is about Mount St. Helens, the eruption. It happened in May, I know, and the first part of July, we were traveling south on a vacation. And as we were driving down the road and got closer to where the Mount St. Helens eruption was, the tree leaves were changing color. It looked like fall. So, am I too loud? No. So I wondered, can you explain why that would happen?
You were on the freeway?
Yeah. But it was July.
Okay. I haven't heard that exactly said, and this was a little distant from the mountain. I can guess the impact that would occur a little distant from the mountain would be from the ash. I mean, the blast itself would affect the blast zone, but more distant would be ashfall, which could have been what affected the trees that you were observing. That's my guess, but I don't know that for sure. That's a possibility.
I have a question. On Mount St. Helens, could you explain why there weren't forest fires at the perimeter or within the blast area? And then the second question is, how would you explain the recovery process after the flood, since it would take some time? Like you mentioned, animals were needed, and things like that were needed to recover the earth. So could you explain those? Well, the first one was, why wasn't there fires on forest fires?
Let me answer that first. Why wasn't there fire? Well, first of all, you could say, why would there be fire? And you think there could be, and there were fires actually, because there was a huge amount of lightning. With the eruption, the blast cloud was just filled with lightning, so the lightning strikes all over that forest, and it did start some fires. But also, I think the ash also was sort of an insulating material. It covered over everything, and ash doesn't burn. So that was probably a fire suppressant. So there were some fires, but maybe not as much as one would expect, and perhaps the ash was a major reason why we didn't have more fire there. That's kind of my guess. I really didn't quite fully hear the second question, I'm afraid. I hear out of one ear, it's my problem. I'm kind of hard of hearing, so.
I just wanted to know what your take on the recovery time for the earth after the flood. I mean, for plants and everything to start taking,
Okay, recovery time. Well, again, I don't know with certainty that sort of thing. But if you judge from Mount St. Helens, of course, that recovered much more quickly than anticipated. So probably we could say the flood recovered, and we know it did recover, and probably more rapidly. Hard to really gauge exactly how long it took, and I'm sure it's an area by area thing, because if the thing that determines rapid recovery is if you have a lot of biological legacies, if you've got a log mat that lands someplace, I mean, that should recover very quickly, and probably would after the flood. If you've got some place that's geologically active, it's going to be a long, long time until the geology stabilizes. So I think it was a mosaic of rapid recovery and slow recovery and such. That's the best I could say.
Mount Ararat, elevation differences between Mount Ararat and
Yes.
Mount St. Helens. Much of a difference?
Well, I've never been there. Mount Ararat is a stratovolcano, and Mount St. Helens is a stratovolcano. So they're the same type of mountain, and there are similarities. I don't know much of anything about the biology of Mount Ararat, but I would suspect that if Mount Ararat erupted and destroyed its local biology, the recovery would be similar. And that's kind of what these people are saying, that volcano ecology each mountain is a little different, but yet there's a lot of similarities between the different mountains and even different disturbances. Some of these same processes are operating in various disturbances and certainly various eruptions.
Well, I can't let this opportunity go by without letting you know that this man asked me to marry him about the moment that Mount St. Helens.
Very good.
blew up.
Great. Thank you.
So it's his fault.
Yes.
One last question. Can we do, as long as it's a quick one, I can come back to you. Bill.
Well, one thing about the time frame with Noah's flood, as I understand it from reading some of the literature with the ice ages and all, we're talking maybe 700 years. Now, Mount St. Helens recovered in what, 20, 30, 40 years?
Well, it depends on what you mean by recovery, because it really hasn't fully recovered.
Right.
So what's your end point?
But I mean, I kind of hiked through there with the hummocks last summer, and, you know, it looked pretty grown up there, I know. But anyway, in 50 years, and when we get into the flood and recovery from Noah's flood, we're talking 700 years. Now, 700 years from now, I bet you Mount St. Helens will be just look like it did before it erupted, right? In 700 years. I mean, a lot can happen in that short a time. So I guess all I'm thinking of is Mount St. Helens 50 years, Noah's flood 700 years, and a lot can happen in that time frame. So that might explain why over the world, you know, in 700 years, a lot can happen, I guess. Is that
Well, first of all, on Mount St. Helens, some people will walk in there and say, wow, look at the devastation. This place looks awful. Others who have seen it before walk in there and say, wow, look at all the recovery. So, I mean, you can have different perspectives on it. I'm sure, you know, that after the flood, it was a complicated time because we had an ice age that was caused by Noah's flood, that followed Noah's flood. Plus, there were volcanic eruptions, and I'm sure there were fires and windstorms and lots of disturbances going on. So that there would be areas recovering, and then there would be some areas that were recovered to a certain degree and were destroyed again by another disturbance. So I think it was a complex of just various scenarios in various areas as to what was happening. And I don't know that you could set a date on exactly when recovery was complete, because it's an ongoing process. Just like our forests here are constantly being disturbed by forest fire or logging or something, and they're constantly working on recovering. So they're in different stages all the time. Can't give you a very straight answer.
Okay, I'm just curious what the theory might be about when the ark came to rest and the animals, I mean, there's continents and there's large bodies of water, and I'm wondering what the theory is, how did they populate all the other continents eventually?
The animals from the ark?
Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, it seems like they must have spread out from that point source, the ark, so they spread out. And I think they spread out or immigrated by various mechanisms. And some walked, some crawled, you know, simple things like that. The birds flew and could travel much faster. They're much more agile. Some were probably transported by humans, I suspect. Certain desirable animals were maybe transported as people spread out. So I think it was a variety of mechanisms. And certainly those things not on the ark started distributed over the earth, and so they would have recovered more quickly across the earth, but those from the ark would be spreading out by whatever means they could, and various means of dispersal, that's just as we have today, animals dispersed by various mechanisms.
Do you mind if I add just one little tidbit there?
Yes.
It is generally viewed that that the ice age was caused by the global flood. That at the end of the global flood, that's when you had this massive ice age. And when all of that ice was, had accumulated up in the polar regions, that the ocean levels were much lower and animals were able to migrate to lands that are currently inaccessible. Because there would have been land bridges, Bering Strait, and those kind of places existed during the ice age that simply aren't accessible by land migration today. One other thing,
And that was probably one of the major things.
Okay, awesome.
You
Yeah,
mentioned, yes.
you know, a lot of people criticize just that how could plants have survived the flood And having some significant experience with botany and plant tissue culture, I mean, plants are very hardy, but there's one ability that plants have that most people are absolutely clueless about, and that's the ability to, for normal plant cells to become embryos. Normal plant cells, the cells of leaves and stems, can undergo what's called somatic embryogenesis. During times of stress, normal plant cells could just go and become an embryo, and a new plant germinate just like that. Incredible. But God had created the world with an amazing ability to adapt and survive, and they were able to survive the flood through all these various mechanisms. It was awesome. Thank you, Dr. Swenson. We appreciate you a bunch. Would you close us out in a word of prayer?
Sure.
We're going to have Dr. Swenson close us out in a word of prayer.
Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for all the folks that came tonight and folks that are listening to this. We thank you for the interest that is shown in this subject, and it's an important subject. Not just what I talked about tonight, but establishing the idea that the Word of God is authoritative, that Genesis is true and can be read as history, and that is the foundation for our doctrines, for our understanding of the rest of Scripture. So help each of us as we think about this to take to heart these matters and to explore further and to try to learn more, because it will be a faith-strengthening activity. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.